Several questions. Do you expect to only transfer bad loans from the 3 banks that have already been earmarked for transfer, or will you include other banks as well? And when do you expect the first transfers to start? Do you have any confirmation that
I am, my focus is sort of 2 things, and then my wife tells me this. I can only do one thing at a time. Okay, so 3 banks or more, and then when? Okay, so yes. First of all, giving the measures where we actually buy the assets with the transfer pricing methodology and all that, we can only do that for the banks which have, first of all, applied, and then the government has decided to be eligible for this support. And that is 3 banks at the moment. Now, and that's sort of going through the procedures outlined in SUXB and sort of the regulation. There is, of course, 2 other banks now that are in a wind down process. And I have said that we are building up an asset management company. We can, of course, play a role, because that would basically help us to build scale in terms of our operations. So we could play a role there, but not with the same type of procedure where there is a transfer pricing methodology and so on. And the way we could actually do that would be in several ways. We could, of course, buy it if we're allowed and get financing for it at market prices or commercial terms. And that's a discussion then in terms of what it is. Or we could even, if needed, manage those assets through a management contract, and by that sort of playing a role in that. But the only thing I'm actually right now planning with is the one thing I know, which is sort of assets from the 3 banks that are eligible for support through the measures. If it makes sense for us, we would be happy to play a role, but if it doesn't, we will try to stay away from it.
When do you expect?
When? Yes. So we are planning for being ready again to start this procedure in the beginning of December or mid-December. We are, of course, waiting for certain things. We still have not received, and I think we are in the same situation here. The situation around this. The final list of the assets to be transferred, we have not seen yet. We have seen one list a couple of weeks ago, which was a good overview from that Bank of Sweden had provided, which sort of listed all the assets that the banks themselves had earmarked for it. There was a lot of situations basically where, an exposure were in 1 or 2 banks, but not the 3rd, which we said that is a very ineffective way of doing it. So that has to be harmonized. And Bank of Sweden has played now a role in terms of making sure that this is harmonized. We would destroy value if we end up in a situation where we only take over the exposure from 2 banks and not the 3rd, because we had to, and that would just sort of be ineffective. So that has been a process, and I'm not really sure if that's sort of been finally concluded. I hope so, and we are waiting for that, and it should come any day, basically. And the other thing that we're actually sort of waiting for from our side is, of course, access to the asset quality review work, so we can really use that as input to our preparations as well. But we sort of set ourselves sort of a timeline where we're ending for being ready in first week of December, and we are executing towards that, and we hope that we can do that. Then I am, as always, been less concerned about the actual start date and more concerned about making sure that we have an effective and efficient transfer of the asset when we get started, because it's not the 100-yard dash, it's sort of the 10,000-meter run we're actually doing here. So I would like to make sure that we actually have an effective way of quickly transfer it over, but in an orderly way, so nothing gets sort of lost in the actual transfer process, because of it's a rush process for that perspective. But we're doing it as fast as we can.
Do you expect that transfers can go ahead at the start of December, even if the test results of the stress tests are not out yet? Or do you expect that the Commission will only approve transfers once the results are out? And do you have any confirmation that the results could be announced on December 30th?
That is what I've heard. I don't have any other information. I know that the appropriate institutions in EU they seem actually quite responsive now, and they're actually working in parallel with this in order to not have to sit and wait until it sort of gets publicly announced. They're doing their own research in the banks. They're doing a number of things in order to actually be ready to take fast decisions as well. So I think there's been a lot of, should we call it input, from many people, including from BMC, that there is a huge cost to delays, and I think they realize that, and they are trying what they can do on their side in order to be as fast as possible. That's my impression right now. I think that there is a lot of activity going on there. Difficult to actually foresee exactly how that decision process is really going to look like, but I'm not planning for anything else than executing on early December.
Katarina,
You said that you're going to take over approximately 4 billion. That's for Nukkaboma and Nalaba alone, or Avanza as well?
Okay, so the 4 billion is the gross exposures for the 3 banks, and it might be so that one of the banks are coming a little bit later. That's sort of the indication I have, but I have nothing I have no firm confirmation in anything.
But the amount is for all 3?
That's and once again, we haven't seen the final scope of the list, so that's sort of only for planning. I think the same list as we started off a couple of months ago, roughly.
Izvolite.
The question about the cost, you mentioned now the European Commission also realizes there's a huge cost involved with the delay. Do you have any assessment of what this 6-month impasse would cost, apart from your operating costs, obviously, which are not that high?
No, and that would save some money. Yeah. No, I there is one. The biggest cost is, of course, that we actually have banks which are not being able to actually provide financing for businesses right now, which means that until we get that resolved, we are still in contraction. And if you look at an outlook basically in Eastern Europe, I mean, Slovenia is actually, when we look into the next year, Slovenia is the only country which IMF is forecasting to still contract. And we need to make sure that we provide this as fast as possible. And what is sort of 1 month of going from contraction to positive development, well, that's a huge value only in sort of a month. So you can sort of put you can make a nice case in any way you like if you look at the big picture here. And of course, what we are doing not the only factor in terms of turning around an economy, of course, but it is an important part. So that delay is, of course, costly from many perspectives. You can also look at there are increasing deteriorations in the balance sheets of the banks, which gives some indication of the value that is sort of causing right now. Would we be able to stop that immediately? Of course not. I mean, it's sort of driven what happened in the markets, but there's a rate of deterioration still ongoing, and as soon as we can start turning that around, we are actually creating value. But I don't have a number. I mean, it's yes. I mean, we did cause some upset within the European institutions because we sent a letter to them from our board, basically pointing out that there is a huge cost of delay. They were a little bit upset, but in the end I think it was a good thing, because right now I actually feel that they are quite attentive and quite supportive and trying to act as fast as possible.
Naslednje vprašanje? Izvolite.
First of all, just a question. Your estimate. So the total estimate for the 3 banks is about 4 billion, whereas the first transfer would be 1 to 1.5 billion.
No, so there are 2 numbers here, and that's a good point. I mean, the 4 billion is actually should we call it the nominal value of the loans that the banks were given out. We're waiting for basically, in the end, the transfer price that will be, in the end, I think, well, decided by DG Comp, but more formally, it's actually a decision by the government that is approved by DG Comp. But in the end, I mean, DG Comp has to basically sort of approve that this is the right transfer price, and that is the value range I was talking about. I don't know what that transfer price will be yet, but we know that most of the value of those assets are destroyed already. It's gone. That's a big loss. That's a real cost of this. Our cost it's important, it's big, but we're talking about billions of value destruction first, and we are putting in place other costs in order to get something back. So it's 2 different things.
I realise you pointed out that the precise portfolio is not known at this point in time, but if you could just estimate how many loans in that loan book are involve several other banks that may never come under your...
Right.
No.
I could give you, actually, I don't have it at the top of my head, but it's a good question. Actually, quite a lot of the exposures, when we looked at least at the preliminary list, were situations where, when we aggregate the exposures from the 3 banks, we were in a situation for a majority of them having the majority of the exposures, I put it that way. So, aggregating the 3 would make us a very, well, basically the natural lead in terms of doing and driving a master restructuring agreement or a syndication or anything like that. So I think the positioning of the loan givers would improve with actually transferring to us, just from that perspective, for a majority of the cases that we looked at. We could probably sort of soon give you a more detailed view on that, because I think that we can do. We're not sort of revealing anything in terms of secret by doing that. So let us get back to that. That could be actually something we could give you. Yeah.
Dobro, spet Reuters.
I have another question. When do you expect to issue bonds, and in what value? And don't you think that this delay from 1 month to another, and we still haven't seen the end of it, increases the chance that Slovenia will eventually need a bailout?
Okay, we start with the first. The bond. That's quite simple. I mean, when we start buying assets, we need to pay for them, and that's when we need to sort of issue the bond. So, it's the same time frame. We have to start basically being able to issue a bond in early December. And as I alluded to before, I mean, the key thing is, of course, to not only be able to issue bond, but since we now had a little bit more time than up until June 28th, we'd like to make sure that we issue bonds that are directly of such a quality that they can be used as collateral in the euro system, so they can provide liquidity to the banks. And there are certain criteria for that. I mean, one is around that the bonds has to be, marketable, and by that it means that in the unlikely event that the banks that have those bonds, i.e. an NLB or a Banca or NKBM, if they would fail, it's collateral for the ECB. So then ECB would like to be able to immediately sell those collaterals in an easy way, and that's why they always require this should be marketable in a sense. And having a listing of those bonds improves the matter. It's still unclear if it's absolutely a requirement, and we're looking into basically doing as much as we can in order to make sure we comply with that. Second criteria is creditworthiness, but with a governmental guarantee, we're sort of having the same credit rating as a sovereign debt. And as long as we are staying at the A- for one of them at least, we are okay, and it's not an issue. And that's why it's also actually important to meet those investors and the rating institutes we have done continually, so we sort of work on providing that credibility there as well. But that's not a real issue. And then the third criteria or set of criteria relates more to the actual proceeds from that bonds. It has to be. It can actually be a zero coupon, or it can be a fixed coupon. It could be a variable coupon, but you have to set it up in a way where it sort of is acceptable to ECB. And related to that, they usually also want to see what they call a cash protocol, i.e. they would like to understand any proceeds that BMC is generating from exiting asset, how we're going to use that money. And they usually insist on that. Well, they always insist on that the proceeds will be used to pay down that bonds with state guarantees first. So we can't sort of go out and do anything else until we actually paid back the loans that we're using. So that's sort of on the bond. It has to start when we're actually paying for the assets, and we're working on basically making sure that. See, now I lost your second question.
Second question, doesn't this delay increase the chance of a bailout?
I don't have enough transparency to have you a direct answer on that. I think I think the most important thing is the credibility, and less so the actual starting date. And if I just sort of try to deduce something from the type of questions that I get from people that are investing in governmental bonds, i.e. the people that any raising of the money. And it's only when Slovenia cannot raise money for its sort of debt that we are sort of in a situation of a bailout, right? So, the government has to be successful raising money as needed. That's sort of the thing. And those investors that are coming here and asking questions, I think they are of course concerned about the deadline, but more so they ask intelligence questions, I would say, in terms of how it's going to happen. How do you make sure that you can operate without being influenced or having to do certain things that will prevail or prolong basically the practice from the past. So I think a lot of it has to do with making sure that this is a reliable and credible and a good and high quality process. So forcing something through that is then causing a lot of problems in the end could actually also be detrimental to what we're trying to achieve. So it has to be balanced. It has to be as fast as possible, but that's more, I think, given that we're in a situation where we have to start turning the economy around. At the same time, we have to make sure that we do it in a way which provides as much credibility from an outside point of view as possible.
SR.
I'll follow up to that if I just turn around. So from the views you've heard from these investors you've spoken with, would you subscribe to the government's view that a bailout would not be required?
I do, yes. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of money which are looking for investment opportunities, and the size of, even in a very, we haven't seen the results of the asset quality review, but even in the worst possible scenario, it's still a very small amount of money from an international perspective. So as long as there's credibility around that this is actually a good investment to make, and you can sort of rely on that things are not going to deteriorate, yes, it can be done. So I think my chairman has a number of times said this. It sort of more lies in the decisions of, I would say the politicians, but the decision-making process around this than anything else, because it is in the hands of Slovenia to be able to do this without a bailout, certainly.
About the
Večer je bil, še potem pa Pop TV.
In terms of the financing calculations, so the first bond issuance will be dedicated entirely to cover the transfer cost. But so, which bit of your operating budget will need to come from the state budget, or will you use any proceeds? If you could just
yes. Now, we have actually proposed 3 different options to the government, and we haven't gotten sort of their indication which one they'd like to do yet. So I don't have the specifics in terms of exactly how we're going to do it yet. We can finance things in different ways. So I wouldn't conclude directly that what you just said, that the bond issuance will only be there to cover the exact transfer price. It might actually be bond issuance where we actually cover some of the operating costs also, if we would need that for liquidity, because of, should we call it, the equity financing would be less liquid, for instance. So we're putting together a package around this. It's a little bit too speculative to say it's going to be this or that until we actually know how we're going to do it, and that also will be clear quite soon. So maybe I hold back on trying to explain exactly, because I'm sure that I say something and then 2 weeks from now it's going to be different, and big issue.
Katarina,
are these going to be 3, 5, 10 years bond? And interest rate you mentioned already 4.5. That's just
right.
Something that you said, or
yes. Okay. So
yes.
No. I mean, it has to be marketable instruments, given what we just said, that they should be ECB eligible. So it's going to be probably a market rate put to them. That's one. Then in terms of the bond, the maturity of the bonds, there is one more thing when it comes to how you create a high quality payment, and that's, when ECB accept those bonds as collateral, they will use what they call a haircut. It's a popular word these days. And that haircut, the size of that haircut depends a little bit on the terms and conditions of that. So a shorter maturity bond gives less of a haircut, and a longer gives a longer one. So for the banks, it would be better if it were very short. But that means that BMC then would have to have the burden of refinancing very quickly again. So we have to find also there a sort of a good solution, and it's probably going to be a mix of 2, 3, 4 year maturity, because since we're executing under the current law, we can't give out bonds longer than our expiry time.
That's 4 years.
That's until the end of 2017 right now. So that's sort of the solution space we're working around also.
Another question here?
Thanks, Olivia. How will this process of restructuring of companies goes? For instance, that company needs another loans, guarantees. How will you manage this with banks and so?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best question. I mean, what do we do with these cases when we actually get them? And the thing is that, first of all, I mean, we will have a very fact-based decision process in order to make sure that we take the right action on these cases. And that has to be grounded in facts. So until we actually know all facts that are relevant in the case, I'm not going to say we're going to do this or that. That's sort of, unfortunately, I think a little bit more of a practice of the past, if I'm being a little bit mean. It has to really be fact-based, based on facts, and making sure that we take the right decision in terms of making sure we create as much value as possible. Which means that we have to do this case by case, and take the time to actually understand what we have before we go out and say exactly what's going to be done. What we can say is that we're going to do it differently than the banks, because we can. As a bank, it's very difficult, for instance, in a situation where you are struggling to fulfill the capital requirements, you have to, it's difficult, for instance, to take an equity stake in a company, because counts adversely to sort of your capital ratios. We don't have that. So for us, if that is the right action, there's nothing that stops us from doing that, if it is the right action. At the same time, converting debt to equity sounds great, but actually you lose priority in terms of getting the proceeds from the company. I mean, you're better protected as having debt than equity, of course. So we have to make sure that we take the right decisions always. The other thing is that when we are owner of companies, we will make sure that we are acting as an asset manager, not a bank, which means that we will be a proactive owner, active owner, and try to make sure that we bring sort of the best ownership practices we can. And that can be quite different from somebody who's more sitting on sort of an equity stake as part of a loan engagement and being a little bit silent and not driving the agenda in terms of what you want to do with the company. So we will be much more active.
Yeah.
Well, everybody's talking about waiting for the stress tests, but I'm interested in what happens once the results are out. What will be the sequence of events? I mean, do we recapitalize banks first, or do we transfer assets to BMC?
Okay,
what will be,
right.
in your view?
Well, so the asset quality review and the stress test are sort of inputs into this process, and actually the exercise was looking at the whole banking sector, and we are dealing with 3 banks, a subset of that. So, from our perspective, there is no need to announce the full results for us to execute. As soon as sort of we have the input, the people that needs to take decisions and green light have the right input, we can go ahead. So it's a little bit delinked actually, but certainly there is a process around that, but it doesn't have to sort of be sequential. We can actually start certain things before. Now, then, taking a step back, we are doing this in order to restart the banks, if I put it that way. So cleaning out the balance sheet and recapitalization of the banks, so they actually have a balance sheet which will support normal business and focus of normal banking operations going forward. So that's a package in a way. And actually, DG Comp would like to understand both sides of that when they actually, in the end, green light this. So capitalization is also state aid, and they would like to understand the full picture. So from their point of view, I think it's sort of one decision or approval they give, is both things. And then there's a timing of things when do we actually do the actual pay in of capital into the banks, and when are the assets starting to happen. And I think those are also a little bit de-linked. So when we start, we will of course start offloading these assets. We will do it over some time. It's not going to be a truckload of papers coming to BMC on a certain day. We will avoid that. But that would be the case if we actually try to do it immediately in one day, right? And that's not a good process. And the actual decision for the government to recapitalize banks, that's important, of course, in the amount, and they actually pay in. I actually don't know that time schedule. But look at it as one rescue package for each bank. It sort of ties together.
Just two short questions, I'll do one by one. The first, you spoke before about the importance of credibility. How important is it, on the other hand, that the Troika seems to be losing some credibility or influence in international markets and among decision makers on the other side?
Ooh, are they? I honestly don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
And the other one is, as you know, there's a big debate in Slovenia about culpability as regards to these bad loans.
Yes.
Do you have screening procedures in place with your hirings so that you don't get people who might be responsible for some of these loans?
Yes, that's certainly one thing we will look into. Yes, I mean that's, we're going to ask the questions, and hopefully we'll screen away, and we're certainly aware of the situation. Will we be able to catch 100%? I hope so. At the same time, we're not sort of either the police or have the investigative sort of powers in order to go and do deep checks in terms of what's if we can't find out, we can't find out in the end. But we certainly are aware of the problem. And the other point is, of course, that when we actually get the files, we also have an obligation to immediately report if we should find something which looks suspicious in the files. And we're setting up both people and resources and procedures for making sure that we actually will deliver on that, because that's, of course, very important. At the same time, we will probably tend to be more forward-looking in order to sort out the things than sort of going backwards, trying to establish blame. But it's important, and there are other sort of institutions that will actually do that, and we have an obligation to make sure that they are informed about anything that we find.
I would like to ask you, what kind of owner are you going to be? Are you going to maximize shareholder value? And are you prepared for negotiations with representative of employees? I know if you are familiar with the situation.
Right. Yes, they are. Okay. So, first of all, let's if we're in a situation where we will actually be an owner of the company, which is not happening directly, well, there might be some equity portions, but that's going to be a small part of the situation. We will have to act as a good owner. As an owner, you're not managing the business as such. So those discussions with, for instance, unit has to be with the right representatives and not really with the owner as such. I mean, there is always consultations, and you should have a good climate, but we're not going to operate according to how you actually run and have good governance in the business we take over. That's important. And the first part of your question, I forgot. Sorry. Are
you going to increase?
What are the objectives? Yes, and that's very clear. I mean, we have a mandate, an objective to make sure that we bring as much money back as possible. So we will look at finding optimal value, the optimal value for sort of the holdings we have, and it's a good point, because we actually don't have a specific mandate to say that we are here to protect jobs. We are not. So we will, and I'll tell you already now, we will certainly have to take very unpopular decisions sometimes in order to do what's economically rational. And therefore we also have to build up an organization which are, should we call it, robust enough to actually execute on that without sort of being, that has to be sort of capable of withstanding tough questions from you and all that actually in the end, because certainly this will happen, unfortunately.